Good evening and welcome to the Future of Europe, live from the KBC headquarters in Brussels. My name is Valérie Thijs and I feel honored to be your host for this unique evening. Because tonight I will be joined here on stage by Peter Kwagebuur, CEO of Mediafin, Johan Thijs from KBC Group, and of course our keynote speaker Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. Yes, indeed, a former NATO Secretary General will share exclusively his vision on the future of Europe with you. After his riveting keynote, Isabel Albers, General Editor at the Suivez L'Echo, will invite him to a fireside chat with possibly your questions. And let's not forget to mention our lively band here on stage, the Great Belgian Songbook, who will make this soundtrack for this evening and this journey tonight into the future of Europe. I hope you are ready, because here we go. More than ever, screens, images, icons influence and trigger our thoughts, our actions. That's why we asked every speaker tonight to select his most iconic images, representing either the future of Europe or today's zeitgeist. The first guest to present his most striking images this evening is Peter Kwagebuur, the CEO of Mediafin. Peter Kwagebuur, welcome for this Future of Europe.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and I would like to welcome everybody who's looking at our site tonight. Welcome for the Future of Europe. Unfortunately, again, digital. We wanted to do a live, but this was impossible due to situations, but next year it'll be in person again, I'm sure. When we invited the keynote speaker some months ago, Mr. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, the former NATO Secretary General, we really thought that the subject of his keynote would still be relevant today. Well, I must say, we could never have conceived that it would be so topical, so extremely topical as it is today if you look at the current situation. So we're very much looking forward to hearing the expert view on the very complex geopolitical situation in Europe and in the world at the moment.
Yes,
so looking forward to that.
We most certainly do. But first thing first, I'm extremely curious to discover the images that you have selected about your business.
Well, of course, Valerie. The first image I selected is very much about our business. It's the image of the European Newspaper of the Year award. Our newspapers are doing extremely well. Last year, our readership grew with 10%, but not only that, the award came from the newspaper trade, who acknowledges the fact that we'll deliver quality every day to our readers. In the spring of 2021, we decided to redesign our newspaper. Next to our news app and our news site, we also wanted to rethink the function of the newspaper. So we did that, and this gave us this award. The jury, a panel of an international panel of journalists, scientists, and art directors gave us this award, the European Newspaper of the Year award. You can imagine that as a company, Mediafin, but more specifically the whole editorial department got a boost from this award, and even enhances the fact that they're trying to bring the best news, that they're trying to be the most reliable news partner every day for our audience in this ever greater getting mess that is the world.
Yes, a mess that's growing, that would be a terrific headline, of course. But your next image, that I think it was quite hard to select one because we needed a fitting visual, and you are talking about, or you will be talking about sound and audio.
Well, you must excuse me for this more opportunistic image that I use, because today, we launched the podcast, the daily podcast of the Suivez L'Echo. So Mediafin is providing every day 2 live podcasts at 7 a.m. every day of the working week with actual news on finance and economic situations. So I use this opportunity to make a little bit of publicity for this event. With these podcasts, with the daily podcasts, we will be true to the uniqueness of our brands on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're trying to offer to the audience an opportunity to begin the day with a head start. So this is my second image. We can pass quickly to the next image.
Okay, and for those who haven't listened to the podcast yet, they can do it from tomorrow, of course. However, you mentioned to stay true to your beliefs and uniqueness. That's something that shouldn't be taken for granted, I think, and especially maybe in journalism. What's your view on that?
Well, the next 2 images, my final 2 images, are of journalists, a man and a woman. We feel that journalists in general are operating in a more and more violent environment, I must say an insecure environment. A study in Belgium showed that 4 out of 5 Belgian journalists feel a roughening in their daily job. They feel in the interaction with the people they report on, it's getting more and more rough. 1 out of 2 of Belgian journalists have already been feeling in their job that they had, how must I say it, verbal violence or physical violence when they were doing their job. So, and it's not only and you can look at the demonstration of last week in Brussels against the measures for COVID. You could see cameramen, photographers, journalists being harassed by the public, being harassed by the demonstrators. So, and it's not only journalists, it's police officers, it's medical staff, it's firefighters. They all feel the roughening of the society we live in. So this is really a changing situation for our journalists. And I must say it's not only in Europe, it's abroad it's even worse. Last year, 45 journalists were killed while doing their job. And of course, Afghanistan is the country where, well, they had the charge of the journalists killed, as we know. But it's not only in Afghanistan. If you look at Europe, last year, Robert R. de Vries, the Dutch journalist, was killed in broad daylight. You have the Belarus journalist, which was called, I have to look at the name because it's not easy to pronounce, Roman Protasevich, who was taken from his airplane together with his girlfriend. He was forced to land by a Belarus jet fighter and imprisoned in Minsk. Last weekend again, the Turkish journalist Sedef Kabas was imprisoned after allegedly insulting the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, and then she was imprisoned. And well, if this would happen, if they applied that in the UK, I think half of England would already be in prison by now. So in light of this, we can only have respect for the courage and the drive that the journalists have in seeking the truth and the facts every day. And again, talking about Afghanistan, this is my last image. If you look at Clarissa Ward from CNN, when all the Western forces left Afghanistan, and she knows Afghanistan is a very dangerous place, she insisted on staying on to report on the situation, knowing how this country looks at women, how they treat women. So we can only have respect, more and more respect for these people who do this job every day.
I concur, and she's truly a very inspiring personality. Thank you, Peter, for your views and for updating us on what's happening with the tent in L'Echo.
Thank you.
Now, we also asked some of your fellow CEOs here in Belgium what their most iconic images are, depicting the future of Europe. And these were their answers.
One of the expected, though nonetheless striking events for me of 21 was Angela Merkel stepping down after 16 years, making her the second longest serving Chancellor of Germany. She's led Germany, her country, but frankly Europe, through a whole range of very deep crises, all the way from back in 2007, the financial crisis, the Greek debt crisis and the impact on the euro. More recently, she steered us through Brexit, and then over the last 2 years, the COVID crisis. Her departure for me opens up a lot of questions about how Europe and the EU project will go for renewed shared leadership across Europe.
If we look to the list of the 100 most important companies in the world, and we compare that list of today with the list of 2000, we unfortunately see that there is a decreased number of European companies on that list. For sure, the Brexit has to do with it. We see that Europe struggles with building or accepting to build big worldwide leading companies. A nice example is the refusal of Europe to approve the merger of Alstom and Siemens to become a world-leading company in public transport. But there is luckily also a good example. Airbus was merged in 2000 to become today the leading company worldwide in the air industry. So Airbus for me is a nice example that Europe can do it. Europe can be leading. We just need the willingness and the determination to do it.
The global pandemic should be a temporary problem, but the real problem is still there. We have a burning platform, and that is the climate crisis. As we speak, we have again record-breaking temperatures in South America and Australia. The world is on fire, and we have no plan, nor are we executing on that plan. Let's see this climate emergency and the transition as an opportunity that we support with an honest and true narrative. It will be a bumpy road, this transition. It will be expensive, but doing nothing is just not an option. The world is on fire and we need to extinguish this fire.
Three powerful selections, each time with a clear voice and a strong vision on the future. Just as my next guest, or actually not really a guest, as we are in his house today to say so. Welcome and good evening, Mr. Thijs, CEO of KBC Group.
Good evening, Valerie, and indeed we are in our house. And actually, as a matter of fact, it's the first time ever that we have two people named Thijs on this stage.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. So, Johan, you have also selected your most gripping pictures. Just the first one is an image that makes a loud and, if I may say so, clear reference to democracy. Why is that?
Well, you know, a while ago I was reading an article in the Financial Times, and the author, so the journalist, was making a big statement of the role of businesses in societal decision-taking. And his statement was that, you know, we play anyway a role in society, and, you know, the working together between business people and the public decision-taking process should be different, and therefore our global decision-making power should be used more. And it intrigued me because, you know, in essence, the world is constantly in crisis modus. And if we face today what we are looking at in the current world, I could detect at least two types of crises. The first one is the declining, people even say the collapse of trust in democracies, in democratic system. And then the obvious one is, of course, the environmental threat, which is on a global scale happening. Now, to get a solution for that is not an easy one. Perhaps here on stage we can easily talk about it, but you know, for resolving the former is clearly needed that we need to have a renewed shared purpose. Whereas the latter can only be solved if you have a global shared purpose. Now, for me, the big question is, where does business fit in? Where is our role to play? And in that perspective, you know, society has this site, and you can say society is on a local level or a global level, whatever, regional level, whatever. A society has to create a framework in which the business operates. Now, created that framework, that's in essence the political task. And therefore, you need to strike the balance between all the different ideologies. And I can give a couple of examples. More or less government, there's a debate which is currently ongoing in Belgium. More or less privatization, more or less conservatism or progressiveness. A lot of things have to be tackled in that perspective.
Yes, and how would you assess politics, today's politics then?
Well, that's quite a difficult question to answer. I would definitely say that current politics are significantly influenced by anxiety and anger. You know, if you look at the media space, a lot of media space is taken by populism. And definitely fake news is on the rise, and it's widely spread. Social media is one of the carriers of that fake news. Now, the good thing about the current situation, besides the fact that there is still a pandemic, is that the pandemic has taught us a couple of things. One of the elements is that if you combine the skills and also the means of private business together with the public resources, you can achieve urgent purposes. I'm clearly talking about the vaccination and the development of vaccination, which has been done over a period of a year, whereas normally it takes 10 years. Now, can you imagine what could happen if we would combine those two efforts to tackle the climate challenge? And I think in that perspective, you know, it's an urgent question. How can we combine better business and business people with public resources? You know, business leaders are mostly of the time rational people, and they're leading quite important institutions, like, for instance, this one. So I think it's an appeal to think and at least consider seriously about how we can bring together those two joint efforts in a better collective decision-taking modus.
Well, but that's actually a very challenging role.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a challenging role because, I mean, in that situation, you know, it's a societal debate. Where does business fit in? And we all know societal debate is influenced by a lot of things, amongst others, for instance, geographical tensions. And I'm clearly talking about what is currently happening on this continent, the borders of Ukraine, where there's a clear, significant rise of tension between, and I use an understatement, between Russia, Ukraine, but also Russia and Europe. And actually, we are very privileged to have our guest speaker here tonight, Mr. Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, because he has been speaking to Mr. Putin at least a dozen times. As a matter of fact, he was actually at the helm of NATO when they met in 2008 with Russia to discuss the accession of Georgia and Ukraine. And already at that time, and I was not there, I know it from the newspapers, Mr. Putin already stated quite clearly that he never ever wanted those countries, in specific terms Ukraine, to join NATO. Now, Mr. Putin is of course a strategist, and he knows to pick his momentum. And, you know, he has actually put, let me phrase it like this, Europe now currently under a stress test. Let's face it, the US is struggling with its identity. They are preoccupied with China, to say the least, but also with the internal policy. You know, Trumpism is on the rise. Mr. Joe Biden is not the most popular president at this very stage. You have inflation, you have a lot of things to concern about. And look at Europe. Mrs. Merkel has stepped down as chancellor. We have Mr. Macron facing elections. And to be straightforward, at least I am not entirely sure about what the European policy is which we are going to follow towards Russia. So, yeah, I think that Mr. de Hoop Scheffer can give us a lot of answers to the question I just raised.
So, where does the old continent then stand in this battle between all those superpowers?
I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I think this is the question. It is something very significant also in the position of Europe in general. You're right. What is our position versus the US? It's perhaps a bizarre remark, but it's a valid question. What's our position versus China? What's our position versus Russia? What is our position as a trade nation? What is our position as a military nation? According to some, it's non-existing. So what are we now talking about when there is potentially war at our borders? So there are a lot of questions which are raised, but as far as I know, unanswered. And for that reason, I'm extremely happy that we have our keynote speaker, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, tonight with us. Because if there is somebody who is well-informed, if there's somebody who has the experience of talking and negotiating with the Russians, then it's him. So we have chosen the right momentum and for sure the right keynote speaker to address them.
Absolutely. I'm really keen to hear him speak in just a few minutes. But could you tell us something about him?
Well, I can tell a lot about Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, for sure. So a couple of things. He was born in Amsterdam, so he's a Dutch citizen. And between 76 and 86, he has been employed in the Foreign Service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. And in that position, he has served in Ghana, but he also served in the Dutch delegation to NATO and also to a lot of other institutions in Europe. Now, actually, the last part of my sentence is actually the summary of the rest of his career, because it always comes back. And to actually skip a lot of introduction to him, I would actually say, let's remember the two most important roles. In 2002, he became Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs. And in 2004, for a period of 5 years, he was nominated as the Secretary General to NATO, and also the chairman of the North Atlantic Society. So in that perspective, he has been at the pinnacle of power in a lot of important institutions. So I'm super happy that we have him here tonight as a keynote speaker, and I'm super happy to give him the floor to give answers, or at least shed a light to answers on the questions which I have just raised, but also the audience can raise afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Johan, for hosting us tonight and being with us. But before we get started, just one practical note from my part. If you, while watching this show, have a question for our keynote speaker, make sure to write it down in the box below. Our editors-in-chief, Peter de Grote and Paul Gérard, will gather them, and maybe you'll hear your question being asked by Isabel Albers during her fireside chat afterwards. But enough for me. Let's give the floor to our esteemed guest, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after having listened to the CEO of KBC, I could not have wished for a better introduction, and not as much about my career, but certainly about Europe and the position Europe and we Europeans are in at the moment. I should tell him immediately that I have a lot of questions as well, and I don't pretend to give you and the audience back home tonight all the answers. But here we go. I'll give it a try. We Europeans, as we're living on the old continent, we have to get used to what I would qualify as a 2.5 superpower world. The United States and China playing in the Premier League. Russia, major power, but second division. And that is a new geopolitical environment for us Europeans, because we have grown used, and I would add too much grown used, to what we qualify as Pax Americana, a one superpower world under US leadership. And as we all know, rehab should follow addiction. So we Europeans should be in a certain process of rehab. What have we done? What does our history look like? Under the American umbrella, the European Union could develop and has developed as a soft power union, and became, as we are now in Europe, a financial, economic and regulatory giant, but until now, and I say this regrettably, a political adolescent and a military midget. And we Europeans are now confronted with the return of great power politics and rivalries. And we're not used to this. And this reality should not come as a surprise, in my opinion, because we have to recognize that the European project has never been designed for the harsh political reality of today. But we have no alternative. We have to face the world as it is head-on to avoid ending up in the nutcracker between those two Premier League players, the United States of America and China, never forgetting, of course, that should go without saying, that equidistance from a European perspective between the US and China is out of the question. The United States are and hopefully remain our major ally. China, we qualify a systemic rival, a competitor, opponent. And China, of course, is an ancient society, respected ancient society, but miles away from what we do consider the core values of our democratic societies. China should be balanced and in certain domains contained. Now, Russia has a leader, I'll come back to him without any doubt. Russia has a leader who refuses to accept that he is not qualified to play in the Premier League and tries to compensate by political and military adventurism. Ukraine was already mentioned. Now, what I would like to do tonight with you is zoom in a bit more on the positions of these major players and, of course, try to draw a few conclusions about the consequences for our continent, the old continent. The United States of America, it was said already, polarized as never before. I would go as far as to say that the US is politically dysfunctional. We have midterm elections this year in November, and they are about the survival of President Biden's internal political agenda. If he loses the midterms, if he loses the House, but he might, I hope not, also lose the Senate, then his internal agenda will come to a halt. And we have, let's not forget, in 2024 already, we have presidential elections, where it is very important that we will not see the return of President Trump or a Trump clone in the White House. Focus, foreign policy-wise, of the United States of America very strongly on China, where the US are very busy and very active in establishing a counterweight in the Asia-Pacific region to China. Think about the submarine pact with the US concluded with Australia and the United Kingdom. So focus on China, yes, of course, under present circumstances, also a strong focus on the transatlantic relationship and on Russia, but the main focus is on that other superpower. And like it or not, Pax Americana, as I mentioned and defined, will not come back in its classic form with the United States in the role of world's policeman. We have seen President Obama starting the pivot. We have seen also President Trump, America first, we are not the world's policeman. And we see the same with President Joe Biden. And a good and a bad example, because it was executed badly, is of course the departure of the United States of America from Afghanistan. And the military midget, Europe, the European Union, should also grow up, because I'm convinced that I can imagine many political scenarios in the Sahelian zone in Africa, in the Western Balkans, when there's trouble, where we should act, and where we cannot, as usual, ring the doorbell of the White House and say, Mr. President, could you please help us out, which we have done so often in the past as Europeans. So, Pax Americana will not return in the form we all know. China, the other superpower, still thinking in decades, not in years or election cycles. Xi Jinping is not bothered by election cycles like our leaders. A superpower, behaving like a superpower, assertive, aggressive. Think about the South China Sea, think about the bullying Australia, when Australia only asked for an independent inquiry to the origins of the COVID-19 virus. See, under present circumstances, Lithuania under pressure because it opened a Taiwan office. If that's wise or not, you can have a debate about that. But Lithuania is under extreme strong Chinese pressure. China has an intelligence, foreign policy, economic policy, cultural policy tool, which is called the Belt and Road Initiative. I say intelligent because you never exactly are able to distinguish what is politics, what is economics, what is cultural, what is something else. But China, proactive, very active. A dismal human rights record, in our view, and I mentioned our core values already. And that will create a problem. Think about the 1 million Uyghurs in detention camps. Think about strangling democracy in Hong Kong. Think about the Falun Gong. Think about Tibet. That will be, also for us Europeans, also for the West, a very complicated discussion, because we are not the boss. We are not in charge. We cannot bully China. I leave this for the discussion. When you want to hear it a bit more undiplomatically, I've told my students from time to time, for China, our choice might be, are we going to protect the Uyghurs, or are we going to export Audis and BMW motor cars? I hope you understand what I mean. Russia. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and he was already on the picture, wants his empire back. His empire, quote unquote. He wants to go back to Yalta, where Europe was divided just after the Second World War. Rather back to the 19th century. The big nations have spheres of influence. He wants the United States out of Europe. That is also his ambition and his goal in the present very dangerous Ukrainian situation. And if you ask me why this all, we should try to dive into the personal narrative of Vladimir Putin. He was in Dresden, in the unfree part of Germany, in 1989 as a KGB officer, young KGB officer. He saw the Berlin Wall fall. He saw the German masses marching along the streets in Dresden under the cry, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. His whole world fell apart. And as we speak, in 2022, he is trying to rebuild that world. And he has mentioned in speeches on many occasions what he wants. In 2007 in Munich, in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. It was already mentioned earlier tonight. He invaded Georgia in August 2008. He annexed Crimea in 2014 and had his proxies in the Donbas region of Ukraine. This is a straight line in his thinking, and in that regard, and that might sound strange, I'm not surprised in what is happening now and how high he is raising the tension on Ukraine. Internally, Vladimir Putin is certainly an autocrat, and from time to time I see moves in the direction of becoming a dictator. He is papering over the gulag of Joseph Stalin over the past weeks. But, and you remember the picture perhaps, he is an experienced and intelligence operator. He knows where our weak points are in the European Union, in NATO. He has a European policy. The European Union does not have a consensual Russia policy. NATO does not have a consensual Russia policy. He knows this, and he wants to talk, as we have seen over the past weeks, exclusively to the United States of America, wants to play in the Premier League. But, and here comes a but, and a big one, I think that Vladimir Putin, in the end, is more concerned about the governance, the rule of law, and the economic prosperity the European Union might bring to the borders of Russia by becoming closer with and to Ukraine, then he is afraid about a NATO attack, because he knows very well that NATO will never ever attack Ukraine. And he also knows very well that NATO will never ever wage war with Russia over Ukraine. That makes the present situation rather complicated. So, in brief, Putin fears the European Union more than he fears NATO. Because if Ukrainians have the ambition to become Poles, and Putin has seen Poland develop, you can say a lot of things about Poland nowadays, seen Poland develop as a democracy, and has seen Poland prosper, that is what Putin does not want on the other side of his border. I hope we can continue this discussion in the Q&A afterwards. He is unpredictable, and that is not without danger. I have met him a few times, and I should also add to the analysis of the person, Vladimir Putin, that he really thinks that our societies here in Western Europe and in the US are rotten. Let me give you one concrete example. More than one time when I met him, he said, "You're from the Netherlands, Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, Secretary General, aren't you not?" I said, "Yes, Mr. President, I'm from the Netherlands." "Oh yeah, that's the country where you have allowed gay marriage, haven't you?" I said, "Yes, Mr. President, that we have gay marriage, indeed, and in many other nations as well in the meantime." That he considers a horror. So what I'm telling my students always at university, I'm telling you tonight, you have to dive into the head, into the personal narrative of those leaders to understand what they want. If you are going to ask me later in the discussion, what will Putin decide? The only thing I can say with authority is that I don't know. I don't know. He will make that decision all by himself. My big concern is that he has now climbed so high up the tree that I do not know exactly to see how he will come down from that tree without losing face. And if there's one thing we all dislike, but Putin dislikes especially, it is losing face. So, the United States of America, China, Russia. Where does this all leave us Europeans, and more in particular the European Union? What is our homework, our to-do list, to prevent ending up in the nutcracker I mentioned, or in the words of my countryman, Professor Luc van Middelaar, philosopher, writer, former advisor of first the European Council President, your countryman Herman van Rompuy, what should we do to prevent that we end up as Europeans in what van Middelaar qualifies as geopolitical loneliness? I have tried for tonight to draft a non-exhaustive, I underline, a non-exhaustive to-do list. First, further strengthen the euro. Not just on the basis of the classic and very valid argument that the euro, of course, is as much a financial monetary project as a political project, but also from a geopolitical perspective. I think the euro should stronger play a role on world markets as a reserve currency. Finish the capital market union and finish the banking union. Very important, I think. Second, be serious about vetting Chinese investments. In the United States, there is an organization, an institution called CFIUS, which checks and vets where the Chinese want to invest. And I think we could be a bit more serious in the European Union about areas, for instance, infrastructure, classic infrastructure, but also, perhaps more important, tech. We Europeans should be careful not to enter into bilateral memoranda of understanding with the Chinese. The Chinese prefer to do business with individual nations. We should tell the Chinese, dear friends, we have Brussels institutions. Go to Brussels. Go to the European Commission. Talk to us in the European Union in Brussels, and don't do it in Rome and in Portugal and elsewhere. That's what I call the bilateral trap. We should not fall into the bilateral trap. Third, and it was also mentioned before in that regard, interesting. Stimulate the discussion on competition policy. In a world where both China and the US are very serious competitors of ours, it could help if the European Union takes the famous, or some will say infamous, Siemens-Alstom case and analyze the pros and cons of such decisions, as it was taken a number of years ago, but then in the 2022 scenario. Sensitive, but given the French and German position on mergers and on state support, I think not a luxury. I think this world and the nutcracker, the risk for the nutcracker, demands that we build stronger European companies. And about Siemens and Alstom, I do not like the Chinese coming to Europe next year or the year after and saying, we can sell you those trains for a third of the price. You build them yourselves. So stimulate a discussion on competition policy. Next point, if we talk about strategic autonomy, we must define and prioritize the most relevant areas where we want to start being strategically autonomous. Now, Peter Wenning, the CEO of ASML, the Dutch advanced chip machine maker, recently mentioned a few with which I tend to agree. He mentioned, first of all, batteries, a battery alliance, a European Union battery alliance. He mentioned semiconductors. You see the chip on your image. On semiconductors, we are too much dependent on Taiwan, South Korea, and yes, China and the United States of America. He mentioned hydrogen, very important element, of course, of climate change and of the European Union's ambitions in the field of climate change. And cloud data storage. 4 very important areas, and we can mention many more, where we should, in his view, Peter Wenning, and in my view, prioritize the discussion on how can we become strategically autonomous. Et oui, Monsieur le Président de la République française, yes, Mr. President of the French Republic, I value your ambitions on strategic autonomy in the realm of security and defense, but please be aware, Mr. President, that in this hard power domain, we need our friends across the Channel, United Kingdom, if we want to be able to seriously project hard power in our unstable neighborhood. In this regard, we should have more attention for the Western Balkans, where Russians and Chinese are very present, and more attention for the Sahelian zone in Africa would not be a luxury. My opinion is that the southern border of the European Union is not in the Mediterranean, but is in Africa, in the Sahel. Penultimate point, German-French leadership is a precondition for any progress where it concerns Europe's geopolitical strength and position. That is why major crises like the COVID pandemic are serious tests for Paris and Berlin to agree and to be credible leaders. They passed the test on COVID. The European Union passed the test on COVID. I mentioned the COVID Recovery Fund. I mentioned the possibility that the Commission can go and borrow money on the international capital markets, a sea change in my opinion. And they now should also pass the test, and that's an important one, in the very serious crisis with Russia on Ukraine, where, as I said, European Union unity is not a given, and where on top of this all, unity with the United States of America is of the essence. And Putin, in that regard, has chosen an interesting tactical moment for his pressure on Ukraine. A new coalition in Germany, which is still a bit wrestling with how to take position vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis Ukraine. And a French president who goes up for re-election next April. So I'm not going to say that there's a vacuum in European Union leadership, but we are close. This list I have presented, not exhaustive, by no means. I could have talked about energy, about climate, the future of the Stability and Growth Pact, the democratic credentials of some European Union members. But my brush, given the time, was a broad one. I have 2 messages in closing. One, and that's in fact the conclusion, I cannot remember a moment in my career, and it's pretty long by now, when the bell for Europe and European unity is ringing so loudly as it is now. Look around, superpower China, assertive, aggressive. Superpower America, polarized, facing a major constitutional crisis. Facing rival superpower China and a revanchist and revisionist Russia. Carve out our position in this area of hard power politics will not be easy because it's not in our DNA. But it should be based on self-confidence. I repeat, we are a financial economic giant, and we should and can grow in the foreign policy and defense domains. My final message is of a different category. It's out of the box. But it is linked to what we heard from KBC's CEO. And that is my opinion that the challenges facing us are not the prerogative of the political class and the public sector alone. Substantial input from the private sector is still too modest, but is of the essence. There is too much operating in silos. Public and private are criticizing each other, usually behind closed doors, and in the company of their peers. Corporate sector has sometimes a questionable reputation in politics, high bonuses, high variable remuneration. And in the boardroom, there is complaining about the limited horizon and opportunistic behavior of the political class. And I think we should, public and private, see much more eye to eye on all relevant topics in the interest of the European project. And I would like to see CEOs and others more actively participating in the debate about the challenges we are facing, the challenges the European Union is facing. See to it that you have each other's cell phone numbers on the public sector and on the private sector. Try to call each other on Sunday night to avoid that both sectors are going divergent paths. That is my plea to public and private. This was my part of the music tonight. I'm now handing over the baton, as they say, to the real music. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening, Jaap.
Good evening, Isabel.
Thank you for your inspiring keynote. But let's go straight into the heart of the matter and start with today's news on that looming war in Ukraine. Until now, it has been mostly a diplomatic crisis, yet with little achieved. Are we now entering the really dangerous, scary phase of a real war the coming days or weeks? Or are there still diplomatic solutions?
We are still talking. Today in Paris, the Normandy format came together, which is Ukraine and Russia, interestingly enough, and France and Germany. So there is still diplomatic activity. But as I said in my keynote, the demands of Russia and of President Putin are so enormous and so bizarre, I would like to add, that we know that NATO and the EU cannot possibly agree to anything. They can agree to many other things, but not to the central demands made by Vladimir Putin. And he is so high up in the tree that, again, as I said, I repeat, how could he climb down without losing face? Where does he find a ladder, and how is he going to climb down?
So you do expect military action?
Well, it's a bit too much to say that I do expect, because I simply don't know. I can't look into Vladimir Putin's head at the moment. Neither can all of us. But I do consider this crisis and the situation as one of the most serious, if not the most serious crisis since the Second World War, where the risk for conflict is really very substantial.
Well, that's heavy. But about looking in Vladimir Putin's head, one thing you said was Putin simply wants his empire back. But in the short term, there's analysts that say, however, no, Putin isn't up to a war at all. He just wants to continuously destabilize that region. That's all.
Let's hope that analysis is correct. But his track record is not so nice. I mentioned Georgia in 2008, Crimea 2014, the Donbass in 2014. So he wants exclusive political influence and leverage over what he considers, which is a strange terminology, his near abroad. This is my near abroad. And what he now is asking basically is that NATO should leave all the nations which were part of the USSR.
About that moment in 2008, the summit of Bucharest, you were Secretary General of NATO at that time. There was that one famous sentence now about Georgia and Ukraine: they will become NATO members. Was it a mistake? I mean, shouldn't the West have respected a bit more Russian history or Russian sentiment on that?
I've qualified this, and I do this again, as an ugly compromise. It was an ugly compromise as a result of a bitter fight between President George W. Bush on the one hand, Chancellor Merkel, and the then French President Sarkozy on the other hand. Up till this very day, I do not exactly understand why Germany and France agreed to the sentence they will become NATO members. As you also know, there was no time framing at all. It could be, and that was, I think, the opinion till hell freezes over, of when pigs can fly, as it goes in the English language. But in retrospect, I would have preferred, but again, this was the fight between the big ones. And in those scenarios, I can tell you, in NATO, you're more secretary than general.
Okay.
There's also a proverb
Yeah.
which goes that when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. I was the grass in that scenario.
I understand.
So there was not much margin, but in retrospect, again, Isabel, whatever text NATO would have adopted at that 2008 summit in Bucharest, it would not have changed Putin's mind at all.
Yeah. And if we look at, from a broader perspective, at that whole region, what do you expect the region, the eastern border of Europe and Russia will be like within 5-year times, or let's say 2030, a bit over this crisis?
It's difficult to say. The only thing I know is, and that's why I specifically mentioned Chinese civilization, that Russian civilization, whichever way you look at it, it was perverted under communism. It is to an extent perverted as we speak, but Russian civilization is to a large extent our civilization. But I do not see any change, certainly not as long as Putin in Russia, as long as Russia takes the position. Russia is in a marriage of convenience, a mariage de raison with China. But Xi Jinping considers Putin his younger nephew. Yeah. But that is a marriage of convenience.
That's a nice marriage.
It's at the moment, partners in that marriage are working rather closely together, I must say. Let's not forget, Isabel, that this whole Ukrainian crisis is watched very, very carefully from Beijing. Mm-hmm. Because there's also not such a thing like Taiwan, which is close to China, and which China, of course, wants to integrate into the People's Republic. So they're watching very carefully how the Americans and how we are going to react in this Ukraine crisis.
Okay, I'll come to China, but first let's zoom in on Europe's role a bit. You said in your speech Europe was meant to be a soft power union, but in this crisis I haven't seen soft power. I haven't seen power at all of Europe. It's pretty much all of the European leaders were looking at what Mr. Blinken and Lavrov or what Biden was discussing. And could Europe do more, or could Europe do better in this crisis?
Well, that depends to a large extent on Scholz and Macron. Because that's why I gave the example on COVID. When Germany and France agree, and my country...
But Macron gets very frustrated because now he wants to have...
Yeah, Macron made a mistake, I think, in the European Parliament last week when he said we're going to have a separate dialogue with Russia on European security. If you have to manage the crisis, I would tell the French president, if you have to manage the crisis, I mean, do not present broad views about the future. But the political adolescent the European Union should grow up, and the military midget should take itself seriously by now. But that's what we have not done for decades.
Yeah, that military midget. Europe hasn't been investing heavily in military force. At the same time, we see how governments have difficulties in convincing their population that military force should be prioritized in tense budgets. What's your view upon that?
I think that situation is slowly changing, but we have neglected, of course, our defense for decades. When the wall fell, we Europeans, we have gone to the beach, organized ourselves a nice glass of cold white wine, and have told the Americans, you are responsible, but that's the way, you are responsible for our security. Pax Americana, addiction to US leadership. And now when Trump came in, he said, oh dear, what's going to happen? The Americans are going to withdraw. We cannot ring that doorbell all the time. It will take a lot of time before we have a European independent capability to project hard power, and therefore we need the United Kingdom. Yeah. Because Germany, for reasons we know and I understand, will never be in the forefront where it concerns Europe, the European Union and hard power. So that leaves after Brexit only France and a number of other European Union nations, and that is simply not enough. So we also need to find a relationship in the security and defense domain with the United Kingdom. I mean, they made the dramatic decision to leave, but we can't do without them, I'm very much afraid.
We need them. Let's zoom in a bit on the economic consequences of this crisis and a bit further. First of all, energy. You see gas prices surge, and if Russia invades Ukraine, it might get worse. You talked about strategic autonomy of Europe. In our country, energy, for example, in our country, there's a very vivid debate about the nuclear exit and the decision to close down our nuclear plants. Is it a wise decision to leave, to close nuclear energy?
My opinion is that it is not a wise decision at all. And it's strange to see Belgium stepping out and the Dutch stepping in.
And the other one stepping in, yeah.
Why?
Why isn't it wise?
I don't see, and nobody has been able to convince me that we can achieve the very strict targets the European Union and we have set for ourselves in 2050 only on the basis of renewables. Look at Germany. Merkel decided the Atomausstieg, to leave nuclear power, to close the nuclear power plants. What is Germany having to do now? Coal, brown coal even. And that will worsen if, as you said in your question, if there will be a huge gas crisis, because Nord Stream 2, that pipeline will not come into effect. That might be one of the sanctions from our side. Then Putin could, I don't know, but Putin could close the gas tap. And then we need an extra cardigan. I mean, then we are in trouble. Or we go for biomass. Now, biomass has a carbon footprint which is huge in comparison. Wind and solar will not do the trick. We need gas, we need natural gas. In the Netherlands, the tide is turning. The ambition was all communities and all households should be cut off. We're never going to make that. Mm-hmm. And we, to my joy, of course, are starting a discussion on nuclear power plants. So, but I'm not an advisor of the Belgian coalition. But I do not know why stepping out of nuclear energy now is a wise decision. Okay, that's clear. Another aspect of that strategic autonomy you mentioned in your speech is technology. We're far too dependent on Taiwan and China and other ones. More in general, has the European economy maybe been too open to China? Have we been too friendly to Chinese investors here? Yes, that is why I made a plea in my speech for a more serious vetting of Chinese investments. But also, and then I mentioned Nokia and Ericsson, why are we in such trouble with Huawei? Where some nations say, well, we don't mind that much, but others said we don't want them. And the Dutch, typical polder compromise, we say we don't want them in the inner ring, but we accept them in the outer ring. Why are we in trouble? That is because we have neglected over the past 10, 15 years, and we have Nokia, we have Ericsson. Do we need more Europe first? America first, China is always China first. In many cases, much more Europe. I'm not a Guy Verhofstadt. I'm not a federalist. I don't think a European real federation will ever come about. But I think there are an awful lot of domains where we absolutely need each other. But again, the problem is that this hard power element is not in our DNA. Because that's not the way our founding fathers thought about Europe. So that will change slowly. It will take a lot of time. Yes. Let's move maybe to your two main messages for the business audience. Because one thing that struck me was that you said, the discussion about the challenges facing us, they are not the prerogative of the public sector. We're lacking the voice of CEOs. What should those, and some of them are in the audience at home, what should
those CEOs do?
Well, let me start by saying that a number of years ago there was a, as we all remember, a big banking crisis in the Netherlands.
Not only in the Netherlands.
And it was Sunday night, and I know from authoritative sources that one wasn't able to find the cell phone number of the then Prime Minister. And then I think there's something absolutely wrong.
There's something wrong, yes.
Because a CEO should be able to call in Belgium or the Netherlands a Dutch leading politician on Sunday night, not on Monday morning. I can't call a CEO on Monday morning. He said, no, he's in the conference Wednesday morning, you are the first. The same goes the other way around. No, the politician is making a working visit. You should have the cell phone numbers. You should be able to call, not every Sunday night, but when there's a need on Sunday night, my Sunday night mobile phone mantra. And that's my message for CEOs, many topics we are discussing now, and I have raised in my speech. I want to see more CEOs on television and in social media. I want to see more active participation.
And in newspapers, maybe. Well, we try our best.
Looking at you in newspapers, and let me speak for my own country. We don't see that very often. Mm-hmm. And it's still, they complain about politics. I must admit, politics complain about the corporates. The European Roundtable of Industrialists is a very good example where we see serious input from CEOs of major companies. I would like to see that picture a bit broadened. But I understand CEOs are not always that keen to be questioned and interviewed by very critical journalists.
Well, we try our best. Last question of my part, then we move to the questions of the audience.
By the way, the KBC CEO was very clearly opening the door for this kind of discussion.
Well, I can give him phone numbers if he wants to. I want to conclude with one question. One thing that struck me was you said at a certain moment, I cannot remember a moment in my career when the bell for Europe and European unity was ringing so loudly as it is now. You sound very pessimistic on that unity. Couldn't you give us just a touch or a brin of optimism also about that European dream, or is it really a pessimistic situation?
Let me amend your qualifications. Pessimistic in realistic. I have become. I must admit, in my career, I have become more realist than I was. And my daughters at their age should not be realists, but I have become a realist. But with that realism, I link, and that was also what I used in my speech, self-confidence. We are financial, economically. I mean, the European Commission can give millions fines to the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, the what have you of these world. Self-confidence, but changing your DNA, the experts will say it's impossible, so perhaps DNA is wrong terminology, but changing our mindset from this soft power union in the hard power environment will not happen overnight.
Okay.
But again, I was positive about the COVID-19, about the sea change I mentioned, that the Commission can go and borrow French-German leadership. Let's hope Ukrainian crisis is a second test, that they will succeed also with this test.
Okay. Let's move now to Peter and Paul, if there's any questions from the audience.
There are questions, Isabel.
Yes, Peter.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, I have a question of one of our readers on China. You said this conflict is being watched closely from Beijing, but could you elaborate from your part on what you think that they are seeing at this moment, and what conclusions could they draw from what they are seeing?
So,
what they are seeing at the moment is that there is no complete consensus and unity in NATO and in the European Union. And the Chinese, of course, will be very much interested in the position and the leadership role taken by President Biden on the United States. And for China, and I think I also created that link in my speech, it's about Taiwan. Because there is, in the US position vis-à-vis Taiwan, what one calls with the diplomatic word strategic ambiguity. So the Americans are leaving it a bit for discussion what exactly they would do in the case that China would try to incorporate Taiwan into mainland China, to the People's Republic. They'll say it is already incorporated. Leave that aside. I'm hearing that China is now also very active military on the other side, on the east side of Taiwan. Those are, of course, war games organized by the Chinese. I'm not saying that tomorrow the Chinese will invade Taiwan, but they will watch carefully what kind of leader is Biden, how far does he dare to go, how far does he think he can go. And more in particular, I think in the Asia-Pacific region, we will be watched carefully.
So Taiwan is key. And Paul Gerard, good evening, Paul. You have a question for Jaap also?
Yes, the readers had a lot of questions for him. And in particular, one question comes back many times about Russia, our link, our relation with Russia. I read this: we share more with Russia from a historical point of view than the current situation shows. Why is this enemy image kept in place? And is there any possibility to come back to a more interesting and more useful relationship between EU and Russia?
Is there a possible renewal of that relationship?
I would
Russia?
very much hope so. When I started as NATO Secretary General, and even before as a foreign minister, 2003, 2004, the relationship was quite good. It was good. We had a NATO-Russia Council. We had constructive engagement with Russia. We had our differences, constructive engagement. That has deteriorated over time. Let me look at my and ourselves as well. We might have underestimated the feelings, the real feelings in Russia about what, of course, was a rather fast NATO enlargement. But again, those nations came to NATO of their own free will. I mean, nobody forced them. And we should not forget, I say this even on the present circumstance, we should not forget that Ukraine plays a special role in Russian history, because in Kiev, the Russian Orthodox Church, in 988 after Christ, the Russian Orthodox Church, the leader then converted to Russian Orthodoxy, Christian Orthodoxy. So Ukraine is considered by many Russians as part of Mother Russia, as they call it. But again, Ukraine is a sovereign state. And Putin has signed many documents where it is established that Ukraine is a sovereign state.
Yeah. Yes. Maybe the last one. Peter.
Okay. One more question about democracy, a tough one. Some of our readers are questioning our democratic values. They're saying we need a stronger Europe, that's clear. We need a more integrated Europe. But what if the conclusion is that this stronger Europe and this more integrated Europe isn't compatible with our democratic values? Shouldn't we give up some of our values because we are battling with autocrats? How can we fix this?
No, we should not give up our values, but briefly, we see in Poland and in Hungary those values under severe pressure. The solution is not kicking them out, in my opinion, because the Polish voters, the Polish electorate and the Hungarian electorate will have to decide that this should stop. With China as a superpower, and that's why I half-jokingly said Uyghurs or Audis or BMWs, that is more complicated because we have grown in the West to a world where we call the shots. And China now says, you call the shots in history, my dear friends, but not anymore. Yeah. And that is that we should and remain very critical about Uyghurs. You cannot qualify that as genocide for nothing. But again, if you measure that to our economic ties and the BMWs and the Audis, you have a difficult debate.
Well, okay. Thank you very, very much for your realistic views. But don't forget, optimism is a moral duty. And thank you again, and have a safe trip back home in The Hague.
Many thanks, Isabella. Many thanks for the
Scheffer.
invitation. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And with that inspiring chat, our annual Future of Europe show has come to an end. I still want to say thank you to our esteemed keynote speaker, Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, for his wise answers and clear vision, but also to our other guests this evening, Peter Kwagebuur, Johan Thijs, Peter de Grote, Paul Gerard, Isabel Albers, the CEOs contributing to our video, and of course, you for sending in your questions or simply for attending. Enjoy your evening, and hey, it is still January. I wish you all a happy, healthy and inspiring 2022. Hope to see you next year. Goodbye for now.